Okay, we're on to Chapter 2 now, and we're going to look at how you put a research project together. As long as you follow the guidelines here, you should be able to have a good research project. First thing you do is need a topic, and it must be narrow enough that you can research it. I highly recommend that you use the library site to exclude everything except peer-reviewed journal articles. There is a little checkbox that you can check on, and I'll show you in class, that will sift out all the non-academic research that doesn't really count. If you have no idea, another way is to just reflect on your own personal communication experiences to see what you're interested in communication about. If you're interested in media, the Journalism Quarterly, Journalism of Broadcasting, Communication Research, Communication Research Reports, Journal of Communication, those are all good journals that you can take a look at. There's regionalized speech communication journals like Southern Communication Journal, Western States Communication Journal. You can look through those too. There is a list in your book of communication journals in your appendix. Once you have your topic, you have to narrow the scope so that you can collect your own data. So you might make your topic of interest among college students because it's easy to find college students to ask or to interview or to collect data from. Another important aspect of scope is having just one or two variables. You need really two variables to study something and detect causation or patterns or relationships or differences. If you have just one topic or one variable, you're pretty much limited to describing what you see, which is less interesting than explaining why what you see behaves as it does. You want to convince the reader of your research, which I guess is me at this point, that you've looked at what's been done before about your topic. Don't get too concerned if your topic has no research on it or you can't find any. You can ask me and I can help you find other research if you can't find it by yourself, or you may have a topic where the justification for your study is, hey, look, nobody's done any research in this area. I'm going to explore with my research. Your primary sources are scholarly journal articles. Those are the ones that are written in APA style. The more time you spend with them, the more comfortable you get with the way your finished product that you or your group is going to produce. You can use book chapters and books for secondary sources. Sometimes you'll find things there that you wouldn't find in a journal. Just make sure that they're written in some kind of a scholarly format rather than a popular format. You're allowed to plunder, if it will, the references of articles for which you're interested. Avoid too narrowly defining the population of interest. Cast a wider search net. If your study has been done, don't discard the idea. Consider replicating that project or using a different method to examine the same finding. Using multiple methods is called triangulation. It's one of those jargon words you need to learn for this course. You pretty much can say, well, I'm going to do what they did and see if I can get it to work. And then, of course, as I mentioned up above, examine for anything that's missing in the literature. So if you see two studies that are kind of like what you wanted to do, and after a real serious search you can't find exactly what you want to do, then that's a gap. And researchers often look for holes out there in the research literature. You can find contradictory findings if you look at enough studies, and that can be the justification for your study. A possible job for you when you get out is out of college, and if you're interested at all in doing research, you can really create your own company that does research on a particular area that nobody else does research on, that you determine is needed and that you can sell to some company, saying, did you ever wonder why your customers do this or that, or why they don't buy your product? Well, we did this survey of customers and your service came up and we have all the data, wouldn't you like to buy it? And sometimes you can make a business out of that. Working papers are not quite research. They're kind of, it's still on the drawing board, and sometimes scholars will publish their preliminary findings somehow as a working paper, usually on the internet. But it's not been presented at a conference, and it certainly hasn't been published. Conference papers haven't been published either. The hang-up on publication is that most people consider real research isn't real until it's published. So a conference paper is sort of pre-publishing. Sometimes there are brief research notes that are published by journals where your entire study is reduced to 2 paragraphs. This is one way of sharing your research. But the gold standard of real research is the scholarly journal article. Book chapters in an edited volume are somewhat less because, frankly, if you go to grad school and you make friends who go on to become authors, they could ask you to write a chapter for their book, and it's not the same as being in a journal. In a journal, your work is reviewed by strangers. Quantitative research report, every article, every conference paper, every book chapter has a title, and the title embodies the names of the variables and their relationship to the topic of interest in a very straightforward presentation. The title should not be too clever. So something like the effect of communication anxiety upon a student's performance in college classes. You've got the classic independent variable, that is fear of public speaking, which we call communication anxiety, and then the typical dependent variable, which is grades or performance or GPA. The byline is just who the authors are and who they work for. Usually, if it's academic, it's the university that they're at. The abstract is this 120 word or fewer description of everything you did, including the outcome. So it's not fair to say we studied this because we are interested in that, and we looked at 100 people's responses, and we ran these statistical tests, and then your last sentence in your abstract could not be something like, we found many interesting things. Because you're not teasing the reader with your abstract so that if we tease you enough, you'll go read our article. No, you want to actually give away the ending of your article so that they can decide, hey, I'm not going to read this. Okay, the next part of the research report is the introduction. This is where you lay the groundwork. You present the underlying theories for your problem. Typically the first paragraph is you drawing the reader in somehow about why your topic is important, why it matters. Then the second paragraph is your mention of the most important research that's been done to date. Usually you pay homage to some researcher who got things started for everyone else who followed. Your third and fourth and fifth paragraphs could be 3 articles, at least 3 articles for your research reports that really touch on what you're interested in. And each of those paragraphs lays out in moderate detail about how they did their study, what variables they looked at, how many people they surveyed or experimented with, and what their findings were. And after you lay out those 3 paragraphs for those 3 studies, you should be ready at the end of your introduction to say, based on these studies and based on my topic, here's what I expect to find, which would be in hypothesis form, or here's what I wonder what I'll find, if you want to frame it as a research question. But the introduction must end with either a hypothesis or a research question. It's a requirement. It's the last thing in the introduction, which leads to the next section, the method, where you lay out 3 things. You lay out who you studied, how you studied them, and then you do also some description of your method. Did you use a survey? How many people did you have? How did you choose your sample? Method sections tend to be fairly short, 3 or 4 paragraphs, and you'll see examples of them in studies that you look at. When you do look at studies, just remember, if the study you're citing runs 30 paragraphs, that doesn't mean you need 30 paragraphs for an acceptable project. Typically, you can do a pretty good research project in 10 to 12 paragraphs. Typically, it's hard to do it in 5 or 6. You're probably looking at 8 or 9 pages to do it correctly. But I know some students take it as a challenge. How can I do this in the fewest words possible? The next section after your method is your results. You've proposed some data and a sampling method, and you analyze it. And the results is simply 3 or 4 paragraphs. Could be as long as 20, could be as few as 2, but at least 3 or 4 paragraphs typically of what you found. We found these relationships among the variables, or we found these differences between the 2 groups that we looked at, or the 3 groups that we looked at of respondents or participants or subjects in our study. And then in the final section of your paper is where you discuss the so what. You typically begin your discussion with your most important finding and what it means, and then you follow that up with any extra findings that you may not have anticipated. You then go into some discussion of what the limitations of your study is. Was my sample too small? Did I ask the wrong questions? You honestly critique yourself in the limitations section of your discussion. And then you conclude by saying, this is what we found. Further research should look at things we didn't look at. Or if we found contradictory findings, future research, when you talk about future research, you're making a call for research. The last part of your paper is the references, and the references contains every study that you cite. So if it's in your paper, it should be in your references. Likewise, if it's not in your paper, it should not be in your references. You can present your results in a narrative format. You can be very personal. So you can say I and you and we and they. Very informally. In a quantitative report, it's pretty much past tense, third person, go very sparingly on the I and we. Only in a qualitative report are you allowed to kind of merge the introduction, methods, results, discussion, and references together. The form of the quantitative report is an awkward fit, frankly, for a qualitative study. This is why I do not require that you write a qualitative paper as I do for quantitative. If you want, you can just do an oral report. The introduction in a qualitative report typically centers on a particular community because qualitative is a little more personal. The research questions tend to be very general. There's no theory you're testing. It's kind of you're collecting the data first just to see where it takes you. The results in the discussion are not separate. They're integrated because the qualitative researcher inserts himself or herself into the study. Whereas in a quantitative report, think of the guy in the white lab coat in the laboratory. He's supposed to be objective and impersonal. So the narrative format is perfectly acceptable. You should be aware that the literature review itself is less formal. Another way of knowing is a qualitative interpretation. And so whatever the criteria are for a quantitative report, those are the ones you apply. Typically reliability and validity, external validity, which is generalizability. Those are the criteria. In a qualitative report, you use completely different criteria like dependability. Ones we'll discuss when we get to qualitative studies. Bear in mind, as the second bullet point is staring you and you're reading it instead of listening to me, no study is perfect. So avoid rejecting a study just because they didn't have a random sample or because they may have framed one of the questions incorrectly. Every study has a flaw. Avoid confusing form of substance. Quantitative and qualitative reports look different, but both are rigorous and scientific. Your authors come from different perspectives. Baxter comes from qualitative, Babby comes from quantitative. Just remember that when you do your research, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, you could be exploring, you could be describing, hopefully you're making an explanation. I really look for explanations. If you're doing qualitative research where variables are less important, you need to reach a fundamental understanding of what the meaning is of some kind of communication act or some communication message. What's your interpretation? What's the meaning? So whether you do quantitative, which is functional, causal, what causes this, or whether you do qualitative, which is understanding, at least you're trying to reach a higher level than mere description. You also have to think about your unit of analysis. You can be studying people, you can be studying groups, you can be looking at organizations. You can even look at something that doesn't have to do with people at all. You could look at the documents they leave behind. When you formulate your questions and design your study, you would like your questions to drive or be driven by the research and purpose that you have at your hands. So make sure that after you get your topic, that you don't ask questions that are not driven by what you've read. Your design also has to emerge from your questions and your hypothesis then. If you have a particular kind of questions about how do people differ, then that's going to determine whether you're going to use a statistical test like a t-test that looks at two different groups, or whether you're going to use an experimental method. You need to determine the role of time in your design. Now, not you, I shouldn't say you, although the slide says you. You'll be doing cross-sectional studies. A longitudinal study is done over a long period of time, and we're in a finite semester here. Please don't do a longitudinal study of people over a 10-year period, because you're just not going to be able to finish it. You need to determine typically your role of whether this is dependent on where it takes place or where it doesn't. So there's field-dependent research and there's field-independent research. That's more applicable to qualitative research than quantitative research. That concludes the show. You see the screen has gone to black. You can take off your headphones now. Thanks for listening.